Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Haag-Streit Academy Improving Outcomes Basic Biometry webinar. My name is Grant Duncan. I'm the Clinical Training Manager with Haag-Streit UK. I'm joined this evening by David Sculfer and my colleague, Sam Laidlaw. I'm delighted to welcome a truly international audience this evening. Although the majority of you are UK-based, we also have participants from as far afield as Colombia, India, Serbia, and Tunisia, to name but a few. Some of you may have attended one of our Improving Outcomes live training events in the past, and we're hoping to begin running these again from summer next year. Today's webinar will feature the key elements from these face-to-face courses and will be presented by our long-standing biometry expert and faculty member, Mr. David Sculfer. David is a consultant optometrist and head of optometry based at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Buckinghamshire. His special interests include biometry, electrodiagnostics, and diabetic retinopathy screening. He's an expert user and UK key opinion leader for the Lenstar LS 900 biometer, although today's session is biometry focused and not device specific. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and register for the second webinar in the series, Improving Outcomes Advanced Biometry, which is scheduled for the same time next Thursday, the 17th of December. This evening, you'll be able to enter questions on the Q&A tab, and we'll take some time to answer some of these at the end of the session. If you have a question that we don't manage to cover later, please email me at the address on the thank you email you should each receive tomorrow. We are recording this webinar and we'll send you a link when it's available. So, without further ado, I'll hand over hosting to Mr. David Sculfer. Thank you.
Right, well, good evening, everybody. So my interest in biometry started really as soon as I joined hospital optometry, because I realised that all those years ago when we only had ultrasound biometry, it was contact biometry, we really weren't getting very good results. And of course, the patients who got poor outcomes following cataract surgery inevitably ended up in the optometry department. And that still happens now, and the patients are sent on the way with a cheery, "Oh, David will sort you out." And it's sometimes a challenge. So it's important. Why is it important? Well, it's because cataract surgery alters your refractive error. But I think of it as a take-home element. So however good the surgery was, or however good the nursing care was, and the hospital food was great, that's the bit that the patient's going to take for the rest of their life. And if you get that bit wrong and put them in a position where they can't, for example, wear glasses comfortably for the rest of their life, they're not going to thank you for it. But of course, these days it's become even more important because we're increasingly using multifocal implants. At Stoke Mandeville, about 25% of our, sorry, not 10% of our patients, NHS patients, have toric implants. And of course, if you're going to use a toric implant or a multifocal implant, there is really no point unless you can get that patient's overall mean sphere to as close to zero as you possibly can. But we also know that wrong IOL power is a leading cause of litigation in cataract surgery, and that applies across the world. And Simon Kelly, in his paper a few years ago now, in 2011, showed that 30% of wrong IOL incidents were due to inaccurate biometry. So it really is a significant problem. And the other thing that they noted was that transcription errors were common, and I'll come on to that once or twice throughout the talk about the problems of transcription errors. So the question that comes up more than anything else, I think, in relation to biometry is, which formula should I be using? So to calculate a lens power, there are some things which we need to measure, and there are some things which we need to estimate. So we can measure corneal power using a keratometer, automated keratometer, or even a full-on corneal topography. But the problem is that it has to make certain assumptions, because of course it's actually not measuring keratometry or the corneal power at all. What it's measuring is the corneal curvature and then converting that into power. And of course, you're not actually measuring the cornea, you are measuring the tear film, which changes every time the patient blinks. So we can measure the axial length now to really within an accuracy of 1 to 2 hundredths of a millimetre. So axial length in optical biometry really has dropped out as far as errors are concerned. It's very easy to get very good, accurate, repeatable measurements. The bit we can't measure, the bit we have to try and predict, and which all the formulas are trying to predict, is this thing called the effective lens position or effective lens power. This is the distance between the cornea and a thin IOL. Now, in fact, the terms effective lens position and effective lens power are pretty much interchangeable, because if a lens sits further forward in the eye, it will have the same effect as a lens of a higher power. So if by moving the lens backwards and forwards, you have the same effect as changing the lens. So effective lens position and effective lens power, those terms pretty much are interchangeable. Here's the original SRK regression formula. You wouldn't want to use this now because it's way out of date, and you would run into problems, but it actually illustrates some very important points. So what Sanders, Retzlaff and Kraft did all those years ago was to analyse 923 cataract outcomes. So they knew what the outcome was, they knew what data had gone into the formula they were using. So their question was, how can we refine that formula to predict the actual result, so to predict what actually happened when we operated on the patient? And they used a technique called regression analysis, which I'll come on to in a moment. But probably one of the key points was that they introduced this concept of the A constant. And again, a common question comes up, well, what is this A constant? So let's just have a look at that. At the bottom of the screen there, you see the original SRK IOL formula, a very simple formula, and as I said earlier, not one I would recommend using now, but it illustrates the principle of how it all fits together. So the A constant describes the lens. So that came from my old, sadly departed friend Wolfgang Heigis, who I had the honour to know. Wolfgang died in October last year and was a huge loss to the ophthalmic community because he did some fabulous work and was a very nice man into the bargain. And I think because English wasn't his first language, just occasionally he would come up with a very simple phrase which really summed up an entire paragraph or chapter in a book. So as his phrase was that it describes the lens. It describes how that lens is going to sit in the eye and how it will behave in terms of its optics. So that can be influenced by things like the IOL material. If you've got a high index lens, that's going to behave differently from a low index lens. The haptic design certainly makes a big difference. If you've got angled haptics, the lens will tend to sit further forward in the eye than one with straight haptics. The optic design makes a difference, whether all the power is on the front surface, back surface, or equally split between the two. And of course it makes a big difference whether that lens is intended for implantation in the anterior chamber or the posterior chamber. So you'll be well aware, if you look at your sheet of lens calculations, that there's often a very big difference between a lens that's going in the AC and one that's going in the posterior chamber. The A constant also allows you to adjust for the measurement method. So if you're doing contact biometry, this is something I'll come on to later, but if you're doing contact biometry with an ultrasound, you'll get a different axial length from if you're doing optical biometry because of corneal compression. So it allows you to adjust for that. So you should be using different constants for optical biometry compared to your contact ultrasound. It also adjusts for systematic errors. So if your keratometer, for example, always overreads by half a diopter, then it will correct for that. Now, of course, that's a two-edged sword because it will correct for that, but if you've got two keratometers, then you're going to come unstuck. So the A constant has different names and different formulas. So in SRKT, it's the A constant. In Hoffa Q, it's the PACD constant. The Holiday 1 form used SF, which is for surgeon factor, and Wolfgang Heigis used A0. So they all do the same job. You can do a direct arithmetic conversion from one to the other, and they all do the same job in the formula, just have different names. I mentioned earlier about how regression analysis was used, and it's worth just spending a moment, if you're not familiar with regression analysis, because it does highlight one or two important principles in biometry. So regression analysis is a method of predicting one value from another. So the example I've given there is you can predict a salary from a person's age. So the salary of somebody in a particular company, perhaps in a particular post. So what you do is to plot the salary against their age, and as they get older and progress up through the company, so you'd naturally expect their salary to increase. But you'll see there that there are quite a few outliers. The data is not a perfect line, it's somewhat scattered, but we'll try and draw a line of best fit through the data. So that highlights even more the fact that you've got one or two quite marked outliers there who simply don't fit that line of best fit, so they will not get a good estimate. So we then analyse the slope of that graph, and we can work out a very simple formula. The salary at a given age is 27 plus the age times 1.5. So 1.5 in this formula is a constant, as is 27. Now if we throw in more variables, let's say the education, whether they've got a degree or not, whether they married the boss's daughter, you can then put in a curved line, and that will give you a better fit to the data. But you'll notice it is a better fit to the data and gives you better prediction, but you've still got some outliers. And this illustrates an important point in biometry, that really all the techniques that we use for calculating lenses will have a similar sort of effect. You will still get outliers. All you're doing is getting a good predicted fit to the data, but there will always be outliers. It will never ever be 100%. And it's important to tell people, to tell your patients about the limitations. I always explain to them we are aiming for a zero prescription at the end of it, but this is not an exact science. So these calculations and measurements will never be 100% accurate. And in fact, you can give patients, you can put some numbers on. If you know what your figures are, you might be able to say to the patient that you've got an 85 to 90% chance of not needing glasses for distance and just needing them for reading. But of course, the corollary to that is they've got about a 10 to 15% chance that they will need glasses for distance. And of course, there's no way of predicting who those patients are going to be, except you can guarantee it will be the most difficult patient of the day. So the more variables we throw into the formula up to a point, the better the prediction. So multivariable formulas, where you're using more than just axial length and keratometry, is undoubtedly better for non-average eyes. For an average eye, which has an axial length of about 23.5 millimeters, and axial keratometry around 43 diopters, all the formulas, even the very early ones, will actually give you pretty good results because they are average eyes. But if you've got a non-average eye, then you really need to put in some more variables. So Wolfgang Heiges and his team, when they analysed their data, they found that optical anterior chamber depth was the next most important parameter, apart from axial length and keratometry. The next one was lens thickness, but in fact the first generation IOL Master wasn't able to measure lens thickness because the returns from the lens were just too small. So happy they didn't include that one, and it was just anterior chamber depth. So they came up with three constants. So you've got A0, which represents the lens, A1 adjusts according to axial length, and A2 according to anterior chamber depth. Jack Holliday in his formula, which in fact he's never published, so we don't know exactly how these fit together, bolts on a few more bits. So he adds in lens thickness, corneal diameter, pre-op refraction, age and gender. You wouldn't have thought that gender would make much difference, but in fact it does. Not a huge difference. These are, you get into the limited gains, but it does make a difference. Graham Barrett with his excellent universal 2 formula, together with anterior chamber depth and lens thickness, also adds corneal diameter, or as it's otherwise known, white to white. But he has another trick up his sleeve, which is that his formula also recognises the change in optics with IOL power. So in optical terms, a 30 diopter lens doesn't behave the same as a 3 diopter lens, apart from being more powerful. The actual optics of that lens are quite different. So the key point to this bit is that modern formulas need more information. So not just axial length and keratometry, you also need to be measuring anterior chamber depth, I would suggest, as a minimum. And if you can measure consistently lens thickness and white to white, then a lot of the modern formulas will handle that. It's quite common as I go around the country looking at people's biometry to find that they are happily measuring anterior chamber depth for every patient, but they're still using an old 2 variable formula where that information is effectively discarded because the formula just can't deal with it. Now, there's a new kid on the block, relatively new now anyway. And this came from the brilliant Warren Hill, who's a surgeon in the States. He's one of those really annoying people who's good at everything. So he's an expert display pilot, a good mathematician, great surgeon, and absolute mine of information for anything to do with biometry. So if you want to look up anything in biometry, have a look at his website, www.drhill.com, and you'll almost certainly find the answer there. So Warren came up with this new method of working out lens power, and it's not a formula, but a method, and in fact it's more or less a statistical method. So how does it work? Well, what he's done is to say what did happen rather than what might happen. So what they've done is to do a huge analysis of a lot of patient data using a mathematical function called radial basis function. This is something which is actually well established in mathematics and data analysis. It's used a lot in artificial intelligence and data interpolation, which it's particularly good at. It's very good at spotting patterns in data which just aren't obvious to the human eye. But I say its key trick is that it uses actual results rather than predictions. It doesn't use an eye model as such. So the current database has over 12,000 patients in it and is growing year by year. There's no reliance on predicting the effective lens position, because in effect the effective lens position falls out of the equation, because the lens is already in the eye. What you're interested in is what data went in, what result came out. And that makes it much better for extreme eyes, because it doesn't rely on predictions, it relies on what actually happened in real patients. And a lot of people around the world now are getting over 90% of their patients within half an diopter. The average for the UK in NHS surgery not that long ago was somewhere around 65%. So we've got a long way to go before we're hitting those sort of levels. So it can be a bit difficult to get your head around Hill RBF, the radial basis function. And I think the easiest way to explain it is that patient comes to the door, they've got an axial length of 24 millimeters, keratometry of 44 diopters. You do the lens calculation and it comes out with a 20 diopter lens. So you put that 20 diopter lens in and the patient comes out half diopter hypermetropic. The next month, the patient with identical measurements comes in, you do the calculations again, not surprisingly it comes out 20 diopters, you put the lens in the patient and they also come out a bit hypermetropic. Following month, a third patient comes to the door, exactly the same measurements, so you do the calculation again and you get the same result. The patient comes out a bit hypermetropic. Now next month when the fourth patient comes in with those same measurements, you would be bonkers to redo the calculations. You know what it's going to tell you, it's going to say 20. But you will say, oh hang on, all my patients have come out a bit hypermetropic, so let's add another half diopter and that will correct it. So this is really what the radial basis function allows you to do. Now, of course, the chance of 4 patients coming through your door on consecutive months is pretty slim, but the chance of 4 patients around the world with very similar measurements having come through the door and been operated on is actually quite high. And that's what it allows you to do, it gives you access to a huge database. So you can think of the RBF as a database of thousands of actual outcomes. And if we plot that on a 3D graph, so we've got an average eye right in the middle there, with an anterior chamber depth on the vertical axis of about 3.5 millimeters, keratometry 43 diopters along the z-axis, and axial length along the horizontal axis. So our average eye sits in the middle. We then plot all our outcomes onto that graph. I'll do it for you. And we end up with this sort of cloud of data. So where you've got a big blob in towards the middle, not surprising, that's an average eye, and most eyes are average, and therefore you've got lots of data in the middle. As you get out towards more extreme eyes with extreme combinations of those 3 parameters, you haven't got quite so many patients, and so your data dot is smaller because you've got very few cases. But of course, as you add more and more cases, so that cloud of data will expand. The nice thing about this is you can actually apply some statistics to it. So you can apply confidence limits, or as the Hill RBF calls it, an inbounds. So basically inbounds means I've got enough data to come up with a statistically robust prediction. And that's why Warren Hill could quite justifiably say to his patient, you have got a 90% chance of not needing glasses for distance afterwards. But statistically, can't argue with that. As I say, the difficulty is every patient hopes they aren't one of the 10%. But sadly, somebody has to be. But it works. It's a really good formula, and it does seem to me to be the way that things are going now. It is big data. Now, in fact, it's going to get even more sophisticated, unfortunately. So Hill RBF 3 is going to use white-to-white lens thickness, central corneal thickness, and gender will be added into those equations. Now, I'm afraid I was really rather cross when I heard that, because there is no way that I can draw all those different parameters on a 3D graph. So that's rather shocked my fox. But I think the key take-home message of this bit is that it is time to ditch two variable formulas. So the days when we just measured axial length and keratometry, those days really are past now. So this slide is taken from Warren Hill's website. I've doctored it slightly. So you can see at the top there, you've got the three two variable formulas, Holiday 1, Q, and SLKT. So they all do pretty well for an average eye. If we look at the longer eyes, Holiday 1 and SLKT actually do reasonably well, but SLKT only behaves well if you make this axial length adjustment. So this was from a paper by Lee Wang and Doug Koch, two very big names in biometry and lens calculation. And you have to add in this little fudge factor once it gets over a certain axial length. But the problem with all these three top formulas is that they rely on there being a normal anterior segment anatomy. If we now move down to the multiple variable formulas, where you are adding in at least an anterior chamber depth, you can see that Wolfgang Heigis, who was really first to market with this formula, still does pretty well these days, certainly outperforms the old two variable formulas. Again, his formula doesn't work quite so well for really long eyes, so we certainly found when we adopted Heigis that some of our patients with sort of 26, 27 millimeter eyes were tending to come out a bit hypermetropic. So we knew we had to aim a little bit more minus with those patients. And Doug Koch and Lee Wang came up with that axial length adjustment. The Holiday 2 formula, which is again a multivariable formula, does very well for all axial lengths, except that you have to add in a fudge factor for short eyes, where you have to use a different constant, a different SF number, and again you have to add in the fudge factor for very long eyes. Thomas Olsen from Denmark with his Olsen C formula, he again was well ahead of the pack. He added in lens thickness and came up with a very good formula, but it's virtually unknown outside Scandinavia. I first came across it years ago when I was doing a talk for a group of doctors from Denmark on behalf of Alcon. And at the end of it, they said, "Oh, what about the Olsen formula?" And I'd literally never heard of it, to my shame. But happily, nor had anyone else in Europe apart from Denmark. So although it was a brilliant formula, it just never got much penetration in the market. Graham Barrett with his Universal 2 formula. Graham has done some fabulous work on biometry, gets some excellent outcomes. And the great thing about the Barrett formula is that it's really good across the entire range. So you don't need to use different constants, you don't need to make adjustments to the axial length so it works for long eyes. It even works down into the minus powered lenses, which a lot of the formulas really start to struggle with, and that's because it adapts to the lens power. And at the bottom we've got Warren Hill's Hill RBF. This is version 2, and provided the parameters are in bounds, where it's got enough data to actually do the calculation for that combination of parameters, then you will get excellent outcomes with it. So it really does work well. But I think the key message is we've really got to move away from whatever NICE might say in their guidance. We really have to move away from SLKT and Q. We're really not doing our patients any favours. The problem is, of course, when you look at the papers, which NICE did, the average patient actually does very well with the old formulas, but it's the non-average patients who make up only a small part of your cohort who are disadvantaged, but there's no question they are disadvantaged. So I think we've rapidly approached the point, and Warren Hill certainly acknowledges this, that keratometry is always going to remain a limiting factor. And the reason for that, as I said earlier, is you're not really measuring the cornea at all. What you're measuring is the tear film. You're not actually measuring the corneal power, you're measuring the corneal curvature and then having to convert it. So there are certain assumptions that you're having to make. Warren actually spends a long time optimizing the corneal surface in his cataract patients before he even get them anywhere near a keratometer. So he really is quite obsessive about it. I think it's likely that multivariable formulas are going to become the norm, and simply because they perform well for all eyes. So I think Haag is the minimum, Barrett Universal behaves very well, and if you've got access to it, then you can move on to the next stage, which is data-driven AI. Now there are a number of formulas coming out now which all work in the same way as Hill RBF. Hill RBF was first to market and they've got a huge amount of data, but there's no question it's going to over time outperform formulas. But I think another key take-home message is that you should avoid online calculators if possible. So when people say what formula should I be using, my first answer is what formulas have you got available on your instrument. So Haag is pretty much universally available, and that's all you've got, then Haag is absolutely fine to use. It will outperform the old two variable formulas. What I'm not keen on people doing is typing data into online calculators, because eventually you will make a mistake and type in a wrong number, and that's really hard to defend, and as Simon Kelly showed, that's actually not uncommon at all. Now, doing the calculations to the nth degree is no use unless you're putting good data in. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes looking at how we can improve precision in our measurements. So we came up with something called the 10 cent, 20 cent and 30 cent test. Now, in fact, it used to be 10 pence, 20 pence, 30 pence tests, but I did this webinar for India a few months ago where we had an audience of over 900, and I had to do away with the pence and change it to cents because everyone recognises cents. So this came about because one of our nurses, who will remain nameless, when I was teaching her to do biometry, I was trying to get across to her the importance of having all your measurements within sort of fairly narrow margins. So I said, right, so if you've got a measurement of 43.6 and 43.8, you've got a difference there in keratometry of 0.2 of a diopter. And she said, oh, I don't understand diopters, I get all flustered with them. So okay, forget, oh, I gave her name away. Forget diopters, think of it in pounds and pence. If you go across the road to Asda, and you've got something which costs £43.60 and something else which costs £43.40, what's the difference? So 20p. Okay, so don't think of it as diopters, think of it as pounds and pence, and all your measurements have got to lie within a limit of 30 pence of each other. So the highest and the lowest numbers in each direction have to be within 0.3 of a diopter or 30 pence or 30 cents. So that was keratometry, that was our 30p test, and then we applied a 20p test for ultrasound axial length, and there we've said all the readings should be within 0.2 of a millimetre, that's our 20 cent test. And then the third test is for optical axial length measurements, and they had to be within 0.1 of a millimetre of each other. That's actually very easy to achieve, but if the patient is moving around, sometimes you will find some outliers which you need to take out. So for optical biometry, with whatever instrument you're using, you've got to look at the repeatability of it. So here's one from the Lenstar. The Lenstar shows you all the readings together, so you can see if you've got any outliers, which happily we haven't on this one. There are one or two things that are worth looking at. Firstly, let me just see if I can annotate the screen. No, it's not going to let me. Never mind. So if you look at the A scan, just above the numbers there, you'll see that it's not picked up the posterior lens capsule. So you would have to move that cursor manually. So the first thing you need to do is just make sure the cursors are in the right place. If you get a warning, it's there for a reading, it's there for a reason. So in this case, it's thrown up a warning that the value is outside the allowed range. So this is the value for the for the aqueous depth. It's a slightly odd expression. I think it's possibly lost in translation, because they're kind of saying that you're not allowed to have an eye with an aqueous depth of less than 1.5 millimeters. What they actually mean is it's outside the expected range. So this is an eye with an unusually shallow anterior chamber depth, and you would need to flag that up with the surgeon. So you have to actually bring those measurements into play by deliberately clicking on them and enabling them. I would say the point is that when it throws up some warnings, I would expect the person doing the biometry to take note of it, to note it in the notes that they have taken note of it, and hopefully have done something about it. So those warnings are there for a good reason, don't ignore them. For the IOL Master users, you will sometimes find you get a double peak due to fine retinal structures. For some reason, the Lenstar doesn't seem to suffer from this problem. I think probably because it works on a different wavelength. So what happens is that the light is bounced off the inner limiting membrane rather than the retinal pigment epithelium, which is where it should be measuring to. So you'll find the measurements come out about 0.1 to 0.35 of a millimetre shorter than they really should. Just occasionally it will pick up choroid rather than retinal pigment epithelium, but it's usually the ILM, and it's often patients with a slightly thickened membrane. So you get this secondary maximum. Now you can expand the horizontal scale on the IOL Master as you can on the Lenstar, and you could actually move that. Cursor manually to pick up the RPE. You've got to be really sure you know what you're doing. Generally, I would say to people, just delete that reading and retake them until you get some consistent readings where it is picking up the RPE. But you can move it manually and just drag and drop it into position. If you've got dense cataracts, you're going to run into problems because the peak that you're looking for is lost in the background noise. So you can see there, we've got a number of peaks, and I could have actually dropped that cursor on any number of them, and they're all equally valid or invalid as the case may be. So what you really want is a nice big peak and very little background noise. But of course that's not easy to achieve when you've got a dense cataract, and the reason the patient's sitting in front of you, in front of your biometry instrument, is because they've got cataracts and the light doesn't get through. So how can we increase that signal to noise ratio? How can we make the peak bigger compared with the background noise? We use a technique called averaging. This slide again was given to me courtesy of Wolfgang Haigis. So on the top we have the average trace. So these are all the peaks. With each time we take a measurement, it just adds all the peaks together. So at the bottom we have the raw signal, and at the top we have the summed signal. So if I run the slide, you'll see how each time we run a trace and it adds, that the background noise will tend to drop out and we'll be left with a signal of interest. So you can see the true signal emerging from the background noise. And in fact, the size of that signal increases according to the square root of the number of repeats that you do. So you do actually get into diminishing returns, and you reach a point where it really doesn't grow anymore. Now this technology has been around for a long time. It was first developed for radar and satellites, where of course you're trying to pick up a very tiny signal amongst a lot of other radio noise. So this is what's used as averaging. We also use it in electrodiagnostics. So the IOL Master, if you've got version 5 software, or the IOL M500, what that does is to average all the available scans. The original software simply took 5 or 10 readings and then gave you an average axial length. What the IOL Master 500, or the later versions of the original IOL Master do, is to average all the scans into a grand average, and then you can get a huge signal to noise ratio. So much better for slightly dense cataracts. Lenstar does the same. The Lenstar uses a spinning glass cube instead of actually moving the mirror inside the instrument backwards and forwards, which is what the IOL Master does. And because that cube is spinning much more quickly, each time you take a scan, it's actually averaging 16 scans. And then because it's averaging 16 scans, you get a bigger signal to noise ratio, and therefore you'll get a much better return for moderate cataracts. It also means because you've got these big returns coming from the lens, for example, you can now get an accurate lens thickness. The Lenstar has an extra trick called dense cataract mode. And this in fact automatically switches in after you've done 3 scans if they've either got small or apparently absent RP peaks. So I've said earlier that each measurement is an average of 16 scans, and what dense cataract mode is to do a grand average. So instead of doing 6 separate scans of 16, it adds them all up together to make a grand average of 96 scans, and therefore you get a higher signal to noise ratio, as I showed earlier. I was slightly worried about this in the early days of the Lenstar, but I have to say I've been really impressed with it. I think I've had in the last, I guess we must have had ours about 8 years now, and I've probably had 2 patients where it gave a wrong reading, but it was so obviously wrong it was quite clear that there was something not quite right about it. So if it gives you a reading, you can hang your hat on it. If it says it's outside, it won't give you a reading, then it simply doesn't have enough data to give you a reliable reading, and you'll have to resort to ultrasound. The newer IOL Master 700 uses a different technology. It uses what's called swept source OCT, and swept source OCT, because it doesn't have any mechanical moving parts, allows you to average a huge number of scans, and therefore you get a better return through dense cataracts. But of course you're paying for that technology a lot more money. So we applied the 20-cent check to A-scan ultrasound. Now, of course, there are 2 ways of doing ultrasound. One is the contact method, which is the commonest one. It's an applanation method, and because it's applanation, that means flattening, and therefore you're going to compress the cornea, typically about 0.2 to 0.3 of a millimetre, but you can easily squash a cornea much more than that if you are heavy-handed. That's why I recommend that ultrasound biometry, if it's contact, is always done with the probe mounted in a tonometer head. You'll get a much more gentle touch and much more controlled. The alternative is to use an immersion probe. In this case, the probe sits in a water bath, which is that little plastic device you can see held against the eye there. And the key advantage of that is that because the weight is spread around the limbus, there's no corneal compression taking place, and therefore you'll get much more repeatable results. So it's a bit harder to learn and a bit messy at first, but you will get some excellent results once you've mastered the technique. But your A-scan ultrasound results should pass the 20-cent check. So here's a scan off our old Alcon ultrasound biometer, and quite rightly it takes 10 measurements and then finds an average. That's perfectly valid in biological measurements, but the problem is that the final result really is only as good as the figures that you've averaged. So if we look here at the arrowed numbers, you've got one measurement of 21.38 millimeters and one of 20.16. Now they can't both be right, so there's a huge difference between those 2. So what you have to do is edit your scans. You have to look at each individual scan and say, okay, I believe this one, but I don't believe that one. You're looking for this 0.2 of a millimeter or 20-cent limit between the longest and shortest. This is what your scan should like. This is printed out and put up in biometry rooms across the country. If you're looking for some clear peaks, you want the lens peaks sloping slightly from front to back. That suggests that you're along the optical axis, but probably the key thing you need is the cursor that's marked R, which is the return from the retina. If that's missing, sometimes it will pick up the scleral peak, which is the one just to the right of the one marked R, and then you'll end up with a falsely long eye. You'll end up with a weak IOL implant, and certainly if it's a myopic eye, that patient will end up hypermetropic. This was a very common error back in the days of ultrasound, and it's still a common error now if people don't know what they're doing. So you've really got to compare the scan that's in front of you with this model scan, and to make sure particularly you've got that good retinal return rising sharply from the baseline. Now, keratometry, as I said earlier, is rapidly becoming a limiting factor, and the automated keratometers work by projecting lights onto the cornea, filming them, and then analysing the separation of those dots. And then it uses the corneal curvature to convert into corneal power. So the old Lenstar just has 6 points. If you've got one of those points missing, it's having to do an awful lot of interpolation. So really, if you're using the old Lenstar, old IOL Master, you've got to make sure you've got all 6 dots showing. The Lenstar has 32 dots in two concentric rings, so a lot more data. But again, I still insist on being able to see all 32 dots. So now we come on to the original 30p check. And this is with a good repeatability and no missing dots. So what you're going to do is compare all the K1 readings with each other. So we've got 42.45, 42.35 and 42.78. So clearly 42.78 fails our 30p test, and that reading should be deleted and retaken. And then again, if we compare the K2 readings in the other meridian, we've got 43.05, 43.66, 43.1. So again, that 43.66 fails our test. So these readings are really not repeatable enough to be reliable. Now, of course, nobody can actually say what the reading should be. All you can ever sometimes say is that they were highly repeatable and I had no reason to think they weren't correct. So, and that's all you can say. You can't say which one is correct. What you can say is that they were or weren't readily repeatable. The Lenstar does the checks for you. It works out the standard deviation from the measurements. So you can see there we've got an outlier that's arrowed at 45.11 diopters and a standard deviation of 0.136. You want the standard deviation to be 0.1 or less, or at least very close to it. And once you edit out that number, your standard deviation drops to 0.085, which is within acceptable limits. So it does that calculation for you. And finally, it's what I call the reality check, which is where you're just simply stopping to say, these measurements look reasonable. You know, is this an average eye? Is it very long, very short? Does that tie up with what I'm seeing with the patient's glasses? Similarly with the keratometry values. And the particular question is, do they tie up with the refractive error? If you see a difference in axial length, you would expect to see a difference in the power of the prescription between the two eyes. And this is particularly important for refractive surgery patients. If you've got a long eye, a flat cornea, and a patient doesn't wear glasses, there's a good chance that they've had refractive surgery. Refractive surgery is something we cover in the advanced webinar next week. So you need to do these brief checks. You should keep some calibration records. You should be calibrating your instrument at least checking the calibration of your instrument at least once a week and keeping those records for, I would suggest, 5 or 6 years. Just shove them in the cupboard and hope you won't need them. The Lenstar actually records the calibration checks for you. The IOL Master, I recommend printing them out and storing them in a cupboard. Check the biometry scans, applying your 10 and 20 cent checks. Check the keratometry readings with your 30 cent checks. Make sure you're using the right A constant for the lens type and the method used, and then finally apply this reality check. So I'm going to finish with a very short talk about optimization of constants. This is something which is much debated, I think probably overhyped. So the A constant that's printed on the packet, on the lens packet, for older designs will be for a contact A scan, and in fact some of them will be for SRK, for the SRKT2 formula, which was obsolete a long time ago. But some of the more modern lenses do actually give you a constant for optical biometry, so just be aware that the lens packet may not be carrying the constant you think it is. If you're doing immersion A scan, you've got no corneal compression, so your A constant will be higher, typically about 0.3, 0.4 higher for the SRKT formula. And if you're doing optical biometry, again your A constant will be higher. And that's because the IOL Master was actually calibrated against immersion ultrasound, and therefore you would expect it to be higher. If you want a good starting point for a new lens design, then the website www.iolcon.org is an excellent starting point. Wolfgang Heigist and his group at Würzburg started a big database of lens constants called ULib, and that data, since Wolfgang retired, that data has now been incorporated into the iolcon.org website. And if you start off with those constants, you will not go far wrong. So optimization simply involves a retrospective analysis of data. So again, coming back to the SRKT formula, we've got their power for ametropia is the A constant minus 2.5 times the axial length minus 0.9 keratometry. And if you just rearrange that formula, once we know what the lens power was that we wish we had used, then we just rearrange it and we can make the A constant the subject of the formula. So why do we do it? Well, we're trying to improve the accuracy of our post-op refractive outcomes. The problem is it doesn't improve precision. Now, I would have said that those two terms were interchangeable. My brilliant mathematician's son would have slapped me, but in fact they are different. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a target shooter, and he's taken 5 shots. The sound didn't quite work. And they are precise because they're tightly clustered, but they're not accurate. He hasn't hit the bullseye. So he adjusts his aim. And now we've got 5 shots, and the average shot, if there is such a thing, is bang in the middle, but he's never actually hit it, so because his clustering is not pretty good, so he's accurate but not precise. What he's really looking for is accurate and precise, where all 5 shots tightly clustered within the bullseye, and that's what we're aiming for. There are different kinds of outcome errors that we're trying to predict, that we're trying to correct. So we're interested in prediction errors. This is the difference between the actual outcome and the intended outcome or the predicted outcome. The mean error is where you average out a prediction error for a cohort of results. So the problem with that one is if half your patients come out +1 and half your patients come out -1, your mean error is 0, so you can pat yourself on the back, but of course none of your patients are terribly happy. So you've got to be a bit careful with mean error. Much more interest is mean absolute error, where you average the prediction error but you ignore the signs. So if you've got patients come out +1, patients come out -1, your mean absolute error is still 1, and therefore you get an indication that your results are not terribly good. So the first thing you have to do is to improve precision, because it's a fine-tuning tool. If you've got a patient who's come out +2 instead of 0, that's not because your A constant needs tweaking. It's a built-in facility on nearly all the optical biometry machines now. And you need a certain amount of preoperative data. You can start with about 11, but if you can get over 200, you'll get much more accurate data, and it should be an ongoing thing. First thing you have to have is a good post-op VA. If you've got somebody whose best corrected vision is 660, they're not going to be able to be refracted to within a sort of diopter or so. So you've got to have a post-op VA of 612 or better. It must be a stable refraction, so more than a month post-op. And if you've got some outliers, so somebody comes out -3, an error has been made somewhere, that data should be excluded. You don't want to include eyes that have had complications. You definitely don't want silicon-filled eyes. You of course want to do this calculation for the same IOL in the capsular bag. If you mix your IOLs in the results, then of course you'll be getting a hopeless average. And ideally you'll use the same keratometer and biometry method. If you really want to be obsessive, as Warren Hill is, then you will calculate your own A constants for each surgeon, technician and instrument combination. There's limitation to what it will do. The results are going to always show some sort of approximately normal distribution. In fact, usually they're a bit skewed. But here we've got 2 surgeons, A and B. They've got the same mean accuracy, so they're both sort of plus 0.25, but a different spread. So they've got the same accuracy but a different amount of precision. So if we optimize both those results, what happens is the curves get shifted to the left, but it doesn't turn surgeon A into surgeon B, and I would certainly rather be operated on by surgeon B. So do beware of the hype. There are a number of studies. Rob Johnson's group in Gloucester did a big study where they found you could really get some huge improvements, but they actually started off using the constants on the lens packet for ultrasound biometry and applied them to optical biometry. So of course they got some good improvements, but in fact if you do the exercise using the IOLcon.org constants, you'll find the gains really are minimal and arguably clinically insignificant. So that's the talk bit finished. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand you back now to Grant, and we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, David. We've only had one question via the Q&A facility, which I think Sam has answered. It was regarding warning emojis on the Lenstar. I'm assuming that then means that David has pretty much covered everything that you guys wanted us to cover. Either that or, like my webcam at the start of this session, the Q&A facility isn't quite working as it should. Suffice to say that tomorrow you will all receive a thank you email, and on that email there will be my email address, which you can send any questions you may have or that may come to you between now and tomorrow that you haven't had the opportunity to ask today. That email will also include details of a link to our online e-learning content, biometry modules. So these are interactive modules that are free to access currently. I think there are 9 of them that you can have a go at. They cover some of the content that Dave has described today, and also some of what we'll be covering next week in the advanced webinar. Another question has just popped up. So, David, Qasim Mansour is asking, does lens factor have any significance?
Yes, so lens factor is simply the it's the constant that's used both in the Barrett formula, although it's not quite used in the same way, and so yes, it has a really big effect. So with the Barrett formula, Graham Barrett has calculated a lot of constants which can be used, and you'll see that on the Barrett website. But again, although they are very reliable, you should at least, very least, be auditing your results. So you may not find that you need to adjust the constant, the lens factor constant, although you can do, but you certainly should be auditing your results. I know the college expect you to do that anyway. And that audit of outcomes will allow you to get an idea of whether you're hitting that 0, and also what percentage of patients come out within that half diopter, 1 diopter limit. So yeah, lens factor is very important. It's simply the A constant, the equivalent to the A constant in the Barrett formula.
Excellent, thank you very much. Another question coming in. In dense cataracts, when Lenstar doesn't read axial length, is it acceptable to input the A-scan result?
It's a very good question, and I know a lot of people do it, and the answer is you've got to be really careful. You've really got to know what you're doing. So let's say you've got a patient with a dense cataract in one eye and you've had to switch to ultrasound, but the other eye has come out perfectly okay on optical biometry. So you can manually put in the axial length and do the calculations. The problem is, if you're doing contact biometry, you will have flattened that eye by about 0.2 to 0.3 millimeter at least. And therefore, if you put that axial length in and you're using the same constants, then you will come up with a lens power which is higher than it really should be, because you've made that eye artificially short. So I think it's fine to do that if you really understand what you're doing. If you're doing immersion biometry, then you can get away with it because, as I said earlier, the optical biometers are actually calibrated against immersion biometry, and the constants will therefore be very, very similar. So it's certainly valid to do it for immersion biometry, but not for contact biometry. Now you can do it, say if you know what you're doing, then you can put those results in and then you choose a different constant, but you've really got to know what you're doing. So in general, I would say don't do it because 2 reasons. One is you will end up using the wrong constant, and secondly, eventually you will put in a wrong reading, and that is absolutely indefensible. So where you possibly can, do the calculations on the instrument where you took the measurements.
Thank you, David. One more question, I think. Where are we? So somebody's asking, do you have any thoughts on the Kane formula?
Yeah, Kane formula, it's another of the artificial intelligence formulas. It's very good. It was a bit later to market. I'm not sure it offers any advantages over Warren Hill's formula. But again, the problem is with the cane formula is that it's not available routinely on biometry instruments. So it means going to a website, typing in the numbers, and you will make an error eventually. So yeah, great, use cane formula, but be really aware that you will eventually make an error. So if you're going to type stuff into online formulas, get someone else to double check it. What I would also suggest doing is do the calculations on your machine using whatever form you like, and just make sure that the result that the cane formula or whatever one you're typing into comes out with is not grossly different from using one of the older formulas, if that's all you've got access to. So yeah, cane formulas, lots of them coming out now. I don't think they've got any advantage on Warren Hill. There might be very small, not theoretical, maybe statistical advantages, but they are small. And I really like the work that Warren Hill has done, and I think it's going to be very hard to improve on. So yeah, you'll see lots of formulas around. People tend to push their own formula, and the formulas often behave very well in their hands, but it's very hard to replicate those results. So I would tend to stick to the better known formulas. I'm say I think the key thing is look at your equipment, look to see what formulas you've got available, and use that one for preference, rather than going to a website and typing numbers in.
Thank you, David. Quickly, one more question. Are there alternate calculation methods for piggyback lenses other than online calculators?
Yeah, piggyback lenses, invariably the manufacturers will have a very good calculation and do the calculations for you. We've used we use two lenses. We use the Rain lens. We've had some quite good results with that, and Rain will do the calculations for you. And we also use the add-on lens, and we've had good results with that. So for the piggyback lenses, the calculation is slightly easier because you're not relying so much on the measurements, you're relying on the patient's refraction, on the patient's refractive error, and therefore the piggyback calculations, which really are beyond the scope of this talk, are very much easier to do and show much less variability.
Excellent. Okay, David, thank you very much for your time this evening. Excellent as always. Look forward to seeing you again next week. If you haven't already registered for next week's webinar, please do so by following the link in the email that, again, you'll receive tomorrow. And if you can't join us then, hopefully we'll get the chance to meet you in person at a Haag-Streit Academy live event next year. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to Sam and to David for your assistance this evening, Sam, answering questions in the background, and for David, your presentation. Stay safe, everybody, and we'll see you at some point in the future. Thanks very much, and good evening.